The phone rang at 6:48 on a Tuesday morning, and I almost didn't answer it because I didn't recognize the number, and because at 62 years old I have finally learned that not every ringing phone deserves my attention, but something made me pick it up. Maybe it was the hour. Maybe it was some old, tired instinct I thought I'd buried 4 years ago, still standing guard even after I told it to stand down. Meg. Just my name, nothing else. But I knew that voice the way you know a smell, from your childhood kitchen, instantly and against your will. Gerald Voss. My hand did something strange. It tightened around the coffee mug like the mug was the thing I needed to hold on to, not the moment. 22 years of partnership, and then 4 years of absolute silence. No birthday card, no call when his mother passed, not even a message when the local paper ran that little piece about the company's 20th anniversary, and quietly failed to mention my name at all. And now, here he was, in my ear, at 6:48 in the morning, saying my name like we'd talked yesterday. Gerald, I said. Not a question. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of sounding surprised, even though my heart was doing something embarrassing in my chest. There was a pause, a long one, long enough that I could hear, faintly, a television in the background of wherever he was, and under that, something else, a thinness in his breathing I didn't remember from before. Gerald used to fill a room before he even opened his mouth. Now he sounded like a man standing in a doorway, unsure if he was allowed to come in. I need to ask you something, he said, and I know I don't have the right to ask you anything. I know that, but I'm asking anyway, because I don't have anybody else to ask. I stood in my kitchen, my small, quiet kitchen, in the house Walter and I bought after everything fell apart. The house that has exactly one dish rack and no boardroom and no nameplate, with my title on it. And I waited, because that's what I'm good at now. Waiting, watching, letting people finish their own sentences instead of finishing them for them. I need a loan, Gerald said. A big one, and I need it fast. I want you to sit with that for a second, the way I had to sit with it, standing there in my socks on a cold kitchen floor at not quite 7 in the morning. The man who pushed me out of the company we built together, who let me walk away with a signature and a severance check instead of a fight, who never once in 4 years asked how I was doing. That man was calling to ask me for money. I didn't answer right away, and in the silence, I found myself remembering the exact temperature of the conference room on the day I signed those papers. I remembered it was raining. I remembered thinking, at the time, that not fighting back was the strongest thing I had ever done in my life. I was about to find out just how right I'd been. To understand why that phone call nearly buckled my knees, you have to understand what Gerald Voss and I built, and what it cost me to build it. I met him in 1998 at a restaurant supply trade show in Columbus, Ohio, of all places. 2 folding tables down from each other, both of us hawking demo units nobody wanted to buy. I was 29 and working commission only for a commercial refrigeration distributor, doing the books on the side for 3 other small businesses because my husband Walter's teaching salary wasn't stretching the way we needed it to. Gerald was 31, loud, charming in the particular way that Ohio men in ill-fitting sport coats can be charming, and utterly, hopelessly bad with numbers. He could sell anything. I mean that as both a compliment and a warning, because I would come to learn both halves of it in equal measure over the following 2 decades. We started Halloran and Voss commercial kitchens with $11,000 between us. $4,000 of it mine, scraped from a savings account I wasn't supposed to touch, and Walter never once made me feel small about the risk, which is one of maybe 600 reasons I still love that man. Gerald had the relationships. I had the discipline. He knew every chef and restaurant owner and hotel purchasing manager between Cleveland and Cincinnati by their first name and their kids' birthdays. I knew exactly how much margin we could give away before we started losing money on a deal, down to the dollar. For the first 12 years, it worked the way good marriages work. Not because we never disagreed, but because we each knew which decisions belonged to the other person, and we didn't fight over territory. Gerald closed deals. I kept us alive. When a client's check bounced, I was the one who caught it 3 days before it would have cost us a payroll cycle. When a supplier tried to slip a price increase past us, buried in fine print, I was the one who caught that too. Gerald used to introduce me at industry dinners as the reason this company still exists, and he said it with real affection, and I believed him. We grew from 2 folding tables to a 14,000 square foot warehouse and showroom outside Dayton. We had 31 employees at our peak. We outfitted restaurant kitchens in 4 states. I raised my daughter Sarah on that company's income, put her through college without loans, and felt, for a long stretch of years, like I had built something that could not be taken from me, because I had built it with my own 2 hands, one ledger line at a time. I want to be honest with you, though, because this is not a story about a woman who was blindsided by a wolf in sheep's clothing. Gerald never hid what he was. He was ambitious in a way that made him restless, and restlessness, in a man who has already tasted a comfortable amount of success, has nowhere to go but toward more. Somewhere around year 18, I started noticing that more had started to mean something different to him than it meant to me. I wanted a stable, well-run, respected regional company that would take care of its people and let me retire with dignity. Gerald wanted an empire. And empires, I would learn, do not have much use for the person who insists on counting the pennies. It didn't happen all at once. Betrayal like this never does. If it did, we'd all see it coming and duck. It happens in inches, and by the time you've noticed the inches add up to a mile, you're already standing somewhere you don't recognize. It started with Todd Bregman. Gerald hired him as an operations consultant. The year I turned 55, a smooth 34-year-old with an MBA from a school Gerald liked to mention in almost every sentence, who talked about scaling and verticals and unlocking value in a way that made my teeth ache. I didn't dislike Todd because he was young. I disliked him because within about 6 weeks of his arrival, meetings that used to include me stopped including me. And I only found out they'd happened because I'd noticed new equipment purchase orders on my desk that I hadn't approved. "It's just faster this way, Meg," Gerald told me, the first time I brought it up. We were in his office, the one with the window facing the loading dock, and he didn't quite look at me when he said it. "Todd's got the bandwidth to move on this stuff in real time. You've got enough on your plate." I did have enough on my plate. That was the maddening thing. He wasn't wrong, exactly. I was still running the books for 31 employees, still catching the errors nobody else caught, still doing the job I had always done. What had changed wasn't my workload. It was my access. Over the following year, I watched myself get slowly, methodically walled off from the parts of the business that mattered. New vendor contracts were negotiated without my sign-off, something that had never once happened in 20 years. A second bank account was opened for a new expansion arm of the company. Halloran and Voss Design Studio, Todd's brainchild, meant to move us into high-end kitchen design for boutique hotels, and I wasn't listed as a signer on it. When I asked why, Gerald told me it was just cleaner to keep the new venture's books separate while it got off the ground, and that I'd be looped in once it stabilized. It never stabilized. Or rather, it stabilized in exactly the wrong direction, though I wouldn't fully understand how wrong for a few more years. I want to tell you about the specific moment I knew, for certain, what was happening, because I think about it more than almost any other moment in this whole story. It was a Thursday in October, and I was walking past the small conference room, the one with the glass wall, the one everybody called the fishbowl. And I saw Gerald and Todd in there with our company attorney, a woman named Priya Shah, who I had personally hired 6 years earlier because I trusted her instincts. They had documents spread across the table. They saw me see them. Nobody waved me in. There was a smaller moment, a few weeks before that one, that I think about almost as often. We had a longtime client, a family who ran 3 diners across 2 counties, people I'd known since before Sarah was born. Their youngest daughter was getting married, and the father called the office to ask, specifically, for me. Not for sales, not for a quote, just to invite Walter and me to the wedding, because he said I was the reason his diners were still standing after the recession. Todd took the call. I found out about the invitation 4 days later, secondhand, from the front desk receptionist, because Todd had apparently told the client I was no longer handling relationship management and had redirected him to a junior account rep who had never met the man in his life. I never got an invitation. I found out later Gerald went instead, alone, and gave a toast. I went back to my office, sat down at my desk, and did something I am not proud of and also do not regret. I started quietly printing copies of every financial document I had access to. Not to steal anything, not to sabotage anything. I told myself, at the time, that I was simply making sure I had my own record of the business I had spent half my life building, in case I ever needed to prove what I already knew to be true. I had no idea that October afternoon, just how much I would need those records, or how long I would have to wait before they mattered. 6 months later, on a Tuesday in April, Priya Shah asked me to come into the fishbowl. I remember it was raining, the kind of steady gray Ohio rain that makes everything smell like wet pavement and diesel. I remember there was a manila folder on the table, closed, and a bottle of water next to it that nobody had opened. And I remember thinking, with a strange, floating calm, that I had known this meeting was coming for a long time. Maybe since that October afternoon. Maybe since the day Todd Bregman first walked through our front door with his leather portfolio and his handshake that lasted 1 second. Too long. Gerald did most of the talking. He'd rehearsed it, I could tell, because he kept using phrases that didn't sound like him. Strategic realignment, operational redundancy. The direction the board feels is necessary. Our board, I should mention, consisted of Gerald, myself, and 2 silent investors who hadn't set foot in the building in 3 years and who, I would later understand, Gerald had spent 18 months quietly courting with a version of events in which I was the obstacle standing between Halloran and Voss and its next chapter of growth. The offer, when it finally came, was this. I would sell my 35% stake back to the company at a valuation Todd's team had calculated, effective immediately, with a severance package covering 18 months of my current salary and continued health coverage for 2 years. In exchange, I would sign a non-disparagement agreement, a non-compete covering the 4-state region we operated in, and I would step down from any operational role, effective that day. I did the math in my head before Priya had even finished reading the terms aloud. The valuation was low. Not criminally low, not low enough to sue over, but low in the specific, deniable way that numbers can be massaged by people who know exactly which levers to pull and exactly how far they can pull them before it becomes provable fraud instead of merely aggressive accounting. I recognized every one of those levers because I was the one who had taught half of them to the people now using them against me. Here's the part I need you to understand, because it's the part people struggle with most when I tell this story. I did not fight. I know how that sounds. I know some of you, right now, watching this, are yelling at your screen, telling me I should have lawyered up, should have gone to the investors myself, should have fought for every dollar and every ounce of dignity I was owed. I understand that instinct completely, because for about 4 minutes, sitting in that fishbowl with rain streaking down the glass, I felt it too. A hot, righteous fury rising up in my chest, ready to slam my hand on that table and demand they explain themselves. And then I looked at Gerald's face, really looked at it, and I saw a man who had already decided, who had spent 18 months building a version of reality in which pushing me out was not just necessary but virtuous. A man who was never going to be talked out of it in that room, on that day, by me. Fighting him there would not have gotten me my company back. It would only have gotten me a longer, uglier, more expensive version of the exact same ending, dragged out over months of depositions and legal fees, with my name attached to a public lawsuit that would follow me into whatever came next. So I picked up the pen. I signed my name. And I said one sentence before I stood up to leave, the only sentence I let myself say in that entire meeting. "You're going to need me a lot sooner than you think, Gerald." He laughed it off. I remember that. He actually laughed, a short, uncomfortable bark of a laugh, and said something about how he appreciated me not making this messier than it needed to be. I didn't answer. I stood up, gathered my coat, and walked out through the warehouse floor one last time, past employees who wouldn't meet my eyes because they already knew, past the loading dock where I'd once negotiated our very first supplier contract, standing in the snow with a clipboard and frozen fingers, and out into the parking lot, into the rain, where I sat in my car for 11 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. I want to describe one more detail from that room, because it's the one that still surfaces in my mind at odd hours, usually while I'm doing something mundane like rinsing a coffee cup. When I stood up to leave, Priya Shah, the woman I had personally hired, the woman I had trusted with our contracts for 6 years, would not meet my eyes. She looked down at the folder in front of her, straightened its edges with both hands, and said nothing at all. I understood, in that moment that she was simply doing her job, that her obligation was to the company and not to me personally, no matter what our working relationship had felt like over the years. It was a small, cold lesson about the difference between friendliness and loyalty, and I carried it with me for a long time afterward, long after I'd made peace with almost everything else. I did not cry in that meeting. I cried in the car. And then I drove home and told my husband the truth, which was that I had just lost the identity I had spent 22 years building, and that I had let it happen without a single raised voice. The hardest part of losing something you built isn't the money, though the money matters. And I won't pretend it didn't sting to watch my severance calendar count down every month like a slow leaking tire. The hardest part is waking up on a Wednesday morning with absolutely nowhere that needs you. For 22 years, I had been needed by 6:15 every weekday morning. Someone needed a signature, a decision, a correction to an invoice, a calm voice on the phone with an angry vendor. My worth had a schedule. And then, overnight, the schedule simply stopped, and I discovered that a great deal of what I had believed about myself, that I was capable, that I was respected, that I mattered to the people around me, had been quietly, invisibly tethered to that job the entire time, and I hadn't noticed the tether until it was cut. Walter was patient with me in a way I will be grateful for until the day I die. He'd come home from his classroom, find me still in my robe at 4 p.m, staring at a laptop I hadn't opened, and he wouldn't lecture me. He'd just sit down next to me on the couch and put his hand over mine and say, "You built something real, Meg. Nobody can take that part away from you, even if they took the building." My daughter Sarah was less patient, though not unkindly so. She was 31 at the time, sharp and driven, and a little bit terrified of turning into me, though she wouldn't have put it that way then. She worked in marketing for a mid-sized manufacturing firm 2 hours away, and she'd call every Sunday. And about a month into my unemployment, she finally said what she'd clearly been holding back. "Mom, I don't understand why you didn't fight him. You had 35%. You had records. You could have taken him apart." I remember exactly how I answered her, because it's the same answer I'd give today. I could have taken years of my life and thrown them into a fight I might not have even won against a man who'd already decided how the story ends. Or I could take what I had left: my name, my health, my marriage, my sanity, and go build something new with it. I chose the thing I could actually control. She wasn't satisfied with that answer at the time. I don't think she fully understood it until much later, until her own turn came to face a version of the same choice. But that's a part of this story I'll come back to, because it matters more than you might think right now. For the first 3 months, I did very little. I let myself grieve, which is a thing I now believe every person who loses a life's work is entitled to do without shame, no matter how fine they're expected to look on the outside. I went for long walks. I reorganized closets that didn't need reorganizing. I read novels I'd been meaning to read for a decade. And underneath all of it, quietly, almost without my permission, my brain kept doing the thing it had always done. It kept looking at numbers. I'd catch myself, in the grocery store, mentally recalculating the unit cost of a bulk item against the smaller package next to it. I'd see a small local restaurant with a help wanted sign and find myself estimating their monthly overhead before I even realized I was doing it. The habits of 22 years don't switch off just because the building you built them in no longer lets you inside. It was Priya Shah, of all people, the attorney who'd sat across from me in that fishbowl and read the terms of my own dismissal aloud, who called me 4 months after I signed and asked if I'd be willing to help a friend of hers who ran a small chain of 3 bakeries and was drowning in bad bookkeeping. "I know it's a strange thing to ask," Priya said, "given everything. But you're the best I've ever seen at this, Meg, and I think you know that." I almost said no. Pride, mostly. Some bruised part of me that didn't want to be anyone's charity case, that didn't want to start over at the bottom of a ladder I used to own the top of. But Walter, when I told him, just shrugged and said, "So don't do it as charity. Do it as a fresh page. Send her an invoice." I sent her an invoice for $400, which felt, at the time, like both the smallest and the largest number I had ever put on a piece of paper. $400 for 11 hours of untangling a 1.5 years of mismatched receipts, mislabeled expense categories, and a payroll system that had been quietly overpaying 2 part-time employees for months without anyone noticing. When I handed the bakery owner, her name was Colleen, and she had flour permanently worked into the creases of her knuckles. A clean, simple one-page summary of exactly where her money had been going. She looked at it for a long moment and then looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen directed at me in over a year. Plain, uncomplicated respect. "Nobody has ever explained my own business to me this clearly," Colleen said. "Not my accountant, not my husband, not the bank. Just you in one afternoon." I drove home that day and cried in my car for the second time in 6 months, except this time it wasn't grief. I didn't have a name for it yet, but I know now it was the first small flicker of something coming back online inside me that I had assumed, for a while, might be gone for good. That was the beginning of everything that came next, though I had no idea. Sitting at my kitchen table drafting my very first client engagement letter in a font I chose specifically because it looked nothing like Halloran and Voss's old letterhead, that I was building the very thing that would one day sit on the other end of a 6:48 in the morning phone call. I called the new business Halloran Ledger Group, which felt, at the time, like an almost defiant act. Putting my own name back on something, plain and unshared, after 2 decades of Halloran and Voss being the only version of my name anyone used. It grew slowly, the way honest things tend to. Priya's bakery owner friend told 2 other small business owners. One of those told a restaurant owner who, small world, had once been a client of Halloran and Voss and remembered exactly which half of that partnership had actually returned his calls. Within a year, I had 11 regular clients, mostly small food service and retail businesses, all of them drowning in exactly the kind of quiet financial chaos I'd spent my whole career learning to untangle. I worked from a spare bedroom, Walter, and I converted into an office, with a window that looked out on our backyard instead of a loading dock, and I discovered something I hadn't expected. I liked this version of the work better. There was no Gerald in this version. There was no Todd Bregman explaining verticals to me. There was just me, a client's tangled books, and the deep, quiet satisfaction of making something make sense again. I heard about Halloran and Voss the way you hear about an ex you still, despite your best efforts, keep half an eye on. Through mutual friends, through industry gossip at the one trade dinner a year I still occasionally attended, through a former employee named Denise who'd left the company about 8 months after I did, and who called me sometimes just to talk. The design studio venture, Denise told me over coffee, about a year and a half after my exit, had expanded fast. 2 new showroom locations, a flashy launch event with a local news crew, a hiring spree that added 12 people to payroll in under a year. Todd Bregman had been promoted to Chief Operating Officer. Gerald had started appearing in a regional business magazine's 40 Under. Well, over. 40 to Watch feature, grinning next to a headline about reinventing a family business for the next generation. I felt something complicated when Denise told me that. Not quite satisfaction, not quite hurt. Mostly, I think, I felt like someone watching a familiar car speed toward a curve I knew, from 22 years of experience, that it could not safely take. Because here is the thing about the specific kind of expansion Todd was selling, and Gerald was buying. It required exactly the discipline I used to provide, and nobody, as far as I could tell, was providing it anymore. Meanwhile, my own life was quietly, unglamorously repairing itself. Sarah's Sunday calls got warmer. Walter and I took the anniversary trip to the Smoky Mountains we'd been postponing since before Sarah was born. I slept 8 hours a night for the first time in a decade, and I stopped, somewhere around month 16, waking up with my jaw clenched. And then, in year 2 of Halloran Ledger Group, Sarah called me on a Tuesday night, not a Sunday, which was how I knew something was wrong before she said a word. "There's a guy at work," Sarah said, and I could hear, underneath her carefully even tone, the particular tightness of someone who has been holding something in for weeks. "Connor. He's a director. I'm not. And lately, every project I bring to leadership gets refined by him before it goes up the chain, and somehow his name ends up on the slide with mine in smaller font underneath it." I sat very still on my end of the phone because I recognized this story. I recognized it in my bones. "How long has this been happening?" I asked. 4 months, maybe 5. I keep telling myself I'm imagining it. But last week, he presented an idea to the VP that was word for word something I'd sent him in an email, and he didn't credit me at all. And when I brought it up to him privately, he told me I was being territorial and that good ideas belong to the team. I want to tell you that I handled this moment perfectly, that I dispensed flawless motherly wisdom in one clean paragraph. I didn't. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, feeling 22 years of my own history rising up in my chest, and I had to consciously separate my daughter's situation from my own before I could actually help her. Sarah, I finally said, I'm going to ask you to do something that's going to feel small and unsatisfying, and I need you to trust me anyway, because I did not do this the first time it happened to me, and I wish I had. What? Start writing it down. Every email he takes credit for, forward a copy to your personal account with a date and one line of context. Every meeting where this happens, send yourself a note within the hour while it's fresh. Not to build a lawsuit. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Just so that if the day ever comes when you need the truth to be undeniable instead of just felt, you'll have it. I didn't tell her, that night, about the folder of records sitting in a locked drawer in my own office. The one I'd started printing the October afternoon I saw Gerald, Todd, and Priya huddled in the fishbowl. I didn't need to tell her the whole story to give her the right piece of it. What I told her instead, over the following months, as her situation with Connor slowly, carefully resolved itself. Not through a dramatic confrontation, but through a quiet, well-documented conversation with HR that Sarah walked into with 6 months of dated, undeniable evidence, and walked out of with a formal credit correction and a lateral transfer to a director who actually valued her. Was the thing I'd learned the hard way and was determined she'd learn the easy way instead. You don't have to win the fight the moment it starts, I told her, one Sunday, months later, after it was resolved. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to fight on someone else's terms, in someone else's timeline, and just quietly make sure that when the truth finally does matter, you're the one holding all of it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is that what you did? With Gerald?" "That's what I did with Gerald," I said. "I just didn't know yet what I was going to need it for. I didn't know, that Sunday, how soon I'd find out." But 3 months later, on a Tuesday morning in October, 4 years, almost to the week, since I'd signed my name in that rain-streaked fishbowl, my phone rang at 6:48 in the morning, and Gerald Voss said my name like no time had passed at all. "I need a loan," Gerald said again, when I didn't answer the first time. "A big one. And I need it fast." I finally found my voice. "How big, Gerald?" $240,000. He said it fast, like a man ripping off a bandage, and then the whole story came tumbling out of him in a way that told me he'd been rehearsing it, probably for days, maybe longer. The design studio expansion. The one Denise had told me about. The flashy locations. The news crew. The magazine feature. Had, over the past 18 months, quietly collapsed under its own weight. Todd Bregman, it turned out, had structured the 2 new showroom leases with personal guarantees attached. Guarantees that Gerald had signed without, apparently, fully understanding what they meant. Trusting Todd's assurance that it was standard practice for growth stage ventures, when the design studio's revenue never materialized the way Todd's projections promised. Because Gerald said, bitterness leaking through his voice for the first time, the projections were garbage, they were built on numbers that never made sense, and I didn't catch it because I don't do numbers. I don't do numbers. The whole arm of the business had defaulted on its lease obligations. Todd, I learned, had left the company 8 months earlier, taking a QO position at a competitor 2 states away, 4 weeks before the first default notice arrived. He had not, as far as Gerald could tell, left behind a single document explaining how any of the underlying financial projections had actually been calculated. The bank was calling in Gerald's personal guarantee, his house. The big one out past the county line that he and his second wife had built after our 15th year in business. The one I'd once attended a 4th of July barbecue at, back when we were still something like friends, was on the line. He needed $240,000 in the next 3 weeks, or he was going to lose it. "I have nowhere else to go," he said. "The bank won't extend. My investors already feel burned by the design studio and won't put in another dollar. I've asked everyone I can think to ask, Meg, and every single one of them said no. And I kept thinking, All week, there's one person who actually knows how to read a balance sheet. One person who would understand exactly what happened here. And it's you. And I know what I did to you. And I'm asking anyway because I am out of anyone else to ask. I let the silence sit there for a long moment, not out of cruelty. I want to be very clear about that, because I know some version of this story could be told as pure vindication. And that's not actually what this was for me, sitting in my kitchen with a cold cup of coffee in my hand. I let the silence sit because I needed a moment to decide what kind of person I wanted to be in it. Send me the numbers, I finally said. All of them. The lease guarantees, the default notices, the design studio's financials going back 3 years, whatever Todd left behind. Everything. You'll do it? You'll help? I said, send me the numbers, Gerald. That's not the same sentence as yes. He sent them within the hour. I think he'd had them ready for days, hoping. I spent the following 2 days doing what I have always done best, what I did for 22 years before anyone ever thanked me for it properly. I read. I traced. I cross-referenced. And what I found, laid out in black and white across 3 years of increasingly desperate financial statements, was not a business that had suffered bad luck. It was a business that had been sold a fantasy by a smooth young man with an MBA and a handshake that lasted 1 second too long, built on projections that anyone with basic diligence discipline would have caught in the first quarter. The exact kind of discipline I had spent 2 decades providing, quietly, in the background, while Gerald took the bows out front. I called him on a Thursday evening. I could hear, in the pause before he answered, that he'd been waiting by the phone. Gerald, I'm not going to give you $240,000, I said, and I heard him exhale, a small, defeated sound. But I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to actually hear it, because I don't think anyone in your life has told you the truth in about 4 years. Okay, he said, quietly. The design studio didn't fail because the market turned, or because the leases were bad luck, or because Todd betrayed you by leaving. It failed because you built an entire second company on numbers nobody with real financial discipline ever checked. And you knew that, on some level, because you spent 22 years working next to someone who would have checked them, and you decided her discipline was slowing you down. You didn't just push me out of a company, Gerald. You pushed out the one thing standing between you and exactly this phone call. He didn't argue. That was the part that surprised me most. 22 years of knowing him, and I'd braced myself for defensiveness, for some version of the fishbowl's smooth corporate language. Instead, there was a long silence. And then, in a voice I hadn't heard from him since our very first year in business, back when we were 2 people in ill-fitting sport coats hawking demo units nobody wanted, he said, I know. I've known for a while. I just didn't want to say it to anyone, because saying it to you would have meant admitting I threw away the best thing I ever had. I sat with that for a moment. And then I told him what I had actually decided to offer, which was not money, because money is the one resource I have never had unlimited amounts of. And I was not going to hand $240,000 of my family's security to a man who had spent 4 years pretending I didn't exist. What I offered instead was this. I would take his books, the whole tangled mess of them, as a paying client of Halloran Ledger Group at my standard rate, and I would spend the next 3 weeks building him the most honest, complete financial picture that business had seen in years. Something he could take to the bank, to a new set of investors, to anyone who might actually extend him a bridge, not out of charity, but because, for the first time in 18 months, someone competent would finally be able to show them the truth clearly enough to trust it. That's not what I called for, he said. I know, I said, but it's what I'm offering. Take it or don't. He took it. I want to tell you honestly that the 3 weeks I spent untangling Gerald Voss's finances were not some cinematic scene of triumphant vindication, all swelling music and slow-motion victory. They were mostly just work, long hours at my kitchen table, the same kind of careful, patient reading I'd done for 22 years, except this time every single hour of it was invoiced and paid, on time, in full, by the man who once told our board I was operational redundancy. The financial picture I built for him was honest enough that his bank extended a restructured payment plan instead of foreclosing, buying him the time to sell the 2 failing design studio locations in an orderly way instead of a fire sale. It wasn't a rescue. His house is smaller now. He and his wife sold the place out past the county line and moved into something a third the size. The original Halloran and Voss kitchen supply business, the one built on actual demand and honest margins, the one I helped build with $11,000 and 4 years of frozen fingers on loading docks, survived, leaner, and considerably more humbled than before. Gerald called me one more time, about 2 months after the last invoice cleared, not to ask for anything, just to talk. He told me Todd Bregman had been quietly let go from his new Souk O position after a similar pattern emerged at the competitor he'd fled to. He told me he'd started, for the first time in his life, reading his own financial statements line by line before signing anything. He told me he was sorry, in the plain, unadorned way people say it when they've finally stopped performing an apology and started actually meaning one. I told him I accepted it, because I did, and because carrying 4 years of quiet resentment around in my chest had never once made me lighter, only heavier, and I was done being heavy. Sarah asked me, not long after, whether I felt like I'd finally won. I thought about that question for a long time before I answered her, because I wanted to give her something true, not something that sounded good. I don't think this was ever about winning, I told her. Winning would have meant fighting him in that fishbowl 4 years ago. And maybe I would have gotten more money out of it. Or maybe I would have lost everything in a lawsuit that dragged on for years. What actually happened is that I kept doing the one thing I've always known how to do. I paid attention, I kept my own records, and I built something real with my own name on it instead of spending 4 years trying to prove a point to a man who wasn't ready to hear it. And when the truth finally mattered, I didn't have to raise my voice to make it undeniable. It already was. Halloran Ledger Group has 34 clients now. I hired my first employee last spring, a sharp 26-year-old named Priya's niece. Actually, which still makes me laugh every time I say it out loud. Sarah got promoted last month, past Connor, into a director role of her own, and she called me the Sunday after to tell me she'd finally cleaned out that old folder of dated emails because she didn't need it anymore. And something about deleting it, she said, felt better than anything the promotion itself had. I think about that fishbowl sometimes, still. The rain on the glass, the manila folder, the pen I picked up without a fight. I used to wonder if I'd been weak that day. I know now I was doing the only thing that was ever going to work. I was patient enough to let the truth arrive on its own schedule, instead of trying to force it to arrive on mine. Gerald got his loan, in the end. Just not the one he called me for. The one he actually needed was the truth, delivered without cruelty, by the one person who had never stopped keeping the books, even after she was told she no longer belonged in the room where they were kept. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's this. You do not have to win every fight the day it starts. Sometimes the strongest, quietest thing you can do is simply keep your own record straight, build something true with your own 2 hands, and wait for the moment when the truth speaks so clearly for itself that you never have to raise your voice at all. That was the last time Gerald Voss called me for anything. And for the first time in 22 years, I didn't need him to. If Margaret's story meant something to you today, you already know someone who needed to hear it. A mother, a sister, a friend who's ever been pushed out of something she built. Send this one to her. And if you want more stories about the quiet strength it takes to walk away without a fight, and what happens when the truth finally catches up on its own schedule, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we post new chapters of the Second Bloom Chronicles 3 times a week, and the next one might be the story you needed most.